Okay, so this is my grandpa on my mother's side, Hector Mackenzie, from Gairloch on the west coast. I was wondering, Grandpa, if you could tell us a little bit about sort of growing up in Gairloch and a wee bit of your background and obviously speaking Gaelic and so on, please.
Yes, well, I was born in 1926, in March 1926, and it was a time when, between the Great War and the last war, the last World War, that was a very difficult time politically, because there was always this threat of some stronger power in Europe coming in and threatening the British Empire. Now, we were born, my sister and I, that was the family, were born in Gairloch, in the parish of Gairloch, and we were brought up in an area where Gaelic was spoken in the home sometimes not. It would depend on the interest that the individual people had in the language. But there was quite a lot of Gaelic spoken from day to day, in and out of the house, at work and so on and so forth. But at the same time, there was a kind of I suppose we could call it a snobbery of some kind, attaching to the considered more modern language, English, because if you knew English very well, you can understand this perfectly well, folks would have a more interest in you as an employee, because English was the language of the country in many ways, and if you were wanting to get on, as they would say, then it was English for you, as it were. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, there were those of us who valued very highly the traditions that we had, and we certainly valued the language that we had. And while it wasn't widespread, it was sufficiently spoken for it to survive for a good many years, and it still has survived. So that was the beginning of things, okay. Yes.
And you're saying there was slight snobbery. Can you remember any times where you felt like maybe you shouldn't be speaking Gaelic, or was there any times that you can remember that stand out for you where you thought?
Not really, but we had lots of stories from my parents, from a previous generation, about teachers, particularly Scottish Education Department, trying to dim down any light there was on Gaelic. In other words, you heard little about the wealth of literature and of folklore and whatnot that was contained in the language. You heard very little of that, and you heard quite a strong emphasis, which I can understand in a sense, on English and learning English and so on. But there wasn't a great enmity or anything like that. It was just the two things went together, you know, from day to day.
Mm-hmm. And so when did you start? So obviously when you were born, you were sort of brought up speaking Gaelic. When was the crossover when you started learning English? Was this in primary school? Or?
Oh, primary school, yes, it was. Right. But we didn't necessarily speak Gaelic in the home like that. It was just, they were interchangeable, pretty much. The two languages were interchangeable, and it was quite a rich way of beginning to speak, if you like.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It's two languages. Yeah.
And how would you see it now, from going back then and now? Would you say how would you compare the two now?
Well, now there is a stronger lobby, if you like, for Gaelic, for pushing it and teaching it and so on. Whether it is effective or not, I wouldn't know, but certainly there is more going for Gaelic, as it were, than there was in my time. There's more broadcasting, there's more educational work in schools, there is lobbying to get schools to have a Gaelic department and all that kind of thing. There's certainly that, but as far as the advancement of the language is concerned, I wouldn't be sure at all.
Okay. And nowadays, do you often speak Gaelic now to? Where would what would the example be? Would you use it now? Is it quite sort of rare now, or?
It's fairly rare. It would be spoken amongst a generation of my own age, or maybe quite a bit younger than that, and by those who purposefully want it to increase and to spread. But apart from that, it's on the way in, it's on the way down, really.
Mm-hmm. And how, on a personal level, how do you feel personally about that? Like, less people are speaking Gaelic now. How do you feel?
I feel quite strongly, in a sense, that we've lost a window, if you like, on life and on culture and on a way of living. We've lost a window on that kind of thing, which is a pity. It's a pity that the more variety of approaches you can have to culture, I think the better.
Mm-hmm. That's good. Okay, I wonder, Grandpa, could you tell us maybe, you take us back in time to the last century, maybe the late 20s and 30s, and any sort of stories you can recall on to?
Yes, well, 1926 I was born, and the early part of that era was the time when, for example, there were already rumblings of threatened war on the continent. But in addition to that, there was an attack on Abyssinia by Mussolini, the Italian dictator, who actually used poison gas on these Abyssinians. And there was the evacuation roughly about that time, that's what I recall, of the residents of St Kilda, an island out in the far Hebrides. Mm-hmm. And I can remember the sheep, the St Kildan sheep, coming to the market in Dingwall. Well, I assume that's where they came from, but crofters in Gairloch suddenly producing a sort of dark-coloured sheep, and we were told at the time that these sheep had come from St Kilda, and they were scattered amongst the local flocks and so on, a few of them. It was also a time when, as I said, rumblings of war were getting louder and louder for those who had ears to hear it on the continent and at home here in Britain. And very soon, of course, by the end of the 30s, by the end of that second rather third decade of the century, war broke out, as we know, and that was a terrific change in the way of life of a lot of us in the Highland area, because we were suddenly issued with gas masks, and the Home Guard was instituted, and it was a time when food scarcities began to loom large on the horizon, and people began to pickle eggs to preserve them so that they could last through the winter. And people began to think in terms of supplies of food from perhaps local sources like venison or fish of various kinds. And these things were ringing quite a definite change in the way that people lived from day to day, and the way people spoke really to one another, because there were new things coming into being each day. There was the appearance of a kind of identity card that everybody had to have, and here and there along the routes to other parts of Rossshire, you had guards asking to see those, asking if they could see those identification cards to make sure that there were no intruders and spies at large. And I'm sure there must have been quite a few of them on the go, because there were stories of broadcasts by a character called Lord Haw Haw, who was a German, a defector to the German side, and who did his best to denigrate and to run down anything to do with Britain and her armies and her navy and services generally.
Okay. How much was that there? Oh, right. Okay.
By the way, I can recall at that early period of my life, maybe the odd visit to Inverness. We would get a car. Taxis weren't so expensive as they are today. You could possibly get a car and take it out for the day to Inverness. And I can remember one occasion in particular in the beginning of the war. It was coming into Inverness with others and coming out at the station, going into the station, and to my utter amazement, there were two, amongst lots of other travellers, there were two figures that stood out at the head of the group. One very tall, a vigorous man, and another looking like an invalid really, and they were none other than King George the VI, who was a very sick man at that time, and Lord Lovat, who was in charge of the men who were training for the commando service at Achnacarry. And these two, I have that memory imprinted clearly on my mind, these two people coming off the train very shortly before King King George the VI died of the trouble that he had. Now, other trips to Inverness just involved perhaps a visit to somebody in hospital, or maybe a visit to the hospital itself for some reason or other. But they were few and far between. But my memory of Inverness at that time was a smallish town, very attractive, the riverside particularly attractive, and also I have memories of very fine high teas before you went home in some of the restaurants in Inverness. They were quite memorable, really, and that's about all I can recall of Inverness, except the fact that there was very often a piper or a musician, a person playing the melodeon or something like that, down at one of the bridges, which made quite an impression on my mind at the time.
Okay. And okay.